Hello A2, welcome to your final approach of the year and the Humanist approach. This is the last new approach that you will look at, and it is revolutionary in that it moves away. So like psychodynamic approach was revolutionary because it looked at mental health in such a different way. The Humanist approach is revolutionary because it again looks at human development in a very different way to psychodynamic. Specification, the specific terminology you could be asked for. You could be asked about the Humanist approach in general, where you can just brain dump absolutely anything you can think of on the page as long as it's well structured, accurate and thoroughly detailed and accurate, I think is what it's called. Free will, you need to talk about free will because it's a really significant concept within the humanist approach. Self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the self, congruence, the role of conditions of worth, and the influence of counselling on psychology. Any of those things could be questions on the exam. So talk about describe the self maybe, or explain the concept of congruence, or define self-actualization, any of those things, or you might need to know about them in more detail. Okay, the humanist approach is a response to the behaviourist and psychodynamic approach, and it's called the third force. So really significant at the time when the humanist approach was being developed. So just before the cognitive approach, you had the behaviourist approach, who believed in environmental determinism, so the idea that stimulus and response, as you know, Pavlov and Skinner. The psychodynamic approach, which believed in psychic determinism, so the idea that we have no control, it's all our unconscious desires controlling our behaviours, we can't make any choices. And are absolutely, and as you can see, because I can identify a type of determinism for the behaviourist approach and a type of determinism for the psychodynamic approach. The humanist approach is unique because it believes humans have free will. It is the first approach, and probably, as far as I'm aware, one of the only approaches that fully accepts the belief that humans have free will, which is which is really positive. In some ways, it was a response to the psychodynamic and the behaviourist. Rogers and Maslow and were the people who, they didn't like the idea that humans were just these passive things that had stuff happen to them and they had no choice and no control. And whilst that brings problems in itself to the approach, which we'll look at, it's really revolutionary. The humanist approach looks at the whole person, and I can always remember my teacher, and I can remember this so clearly from psychology, from my A-level psychology lessons, drawing a flower on the board and saying they viewed humans as unique and individual flowers. And I don't necessarily, that kind of put me off the approach if I'm honest, but it's the idea, I still remember the idea that they consider the person as a whole and as unique individuals. So they consider each flower individually, and they consider the person as a whole, whereas behaviourists would pick it apart, pick all the petals apart and find the stimulus and response. Psychodynamic would pull apart all of the leaves and look for unresolved conflict, biological problems with the neurotransmitters, whatever it might be. The other revolutionary concept that the humanist approach has is the belief that people are basically good and have an innate need to make themselves and the world better. So they always strive to improve. There are things that might stop them, that might change the way they behave, but basically all humans are good and have a desire to make themselves and the world around them better. They are less interested in objective reality, so they're less interested in what's actually happening in the real world and more interested in people's perception and understanding of the world, which is why they reject scientific study. They don't think it matters what research has found, they don't do huge studies. They're not about the nomothetic approach at all. They reject scientific study because they're more interested in the individual, in the persons, and they don't think that can be collected through a sample of 3,000 people. And they use so they access qualitative data and they approach people individually, so case studies, diary accounts, open-ended questionnaires, unstructured interviews, unstructured observations, all of those things. So it's qualitative data and it's a study of the individual, so the ideographic approach, which is very different from lots of other approaches. And they also reject the use of comparative psychology, which is the study of animals. So there's few issues. There are no issues with extrapolation here. They do not use animals, and you can bear that in mind because we do need to draw comparisons between the different approaches. And of course, you know, a lot of approaches that do use animals and are nomothetic and are deterministic. So already knowing all of this stuff, whilst it's not necessary for the spec, is really useful because you need to be able to draw comparisons between the approaches. Okay. there you go. So it rejects the use of animals. It only thinks it's in the individual, the person themselves. Free will, you know loads about, so I'm not going to go on too much about, but it's the conscious control over our own choices. We have free will to control our own choices. However, the humanist approach does acknowledge that other factors exert force. So they do have internal and external factors. So it acknowledges that biology plays a part, that the environment plays a part, that social and cultural aspects play a part, but ultimately we have choice over our own we have control over our own choices. Okay, so the question could be something like, describe the concept of free will in terms of the humanist approach, or describe the view of free will from a humanist point of view. Self-actualization, or why is it significant? Even if not, you can use it as an introduction to the humanist approach, and if you can explain it effectively, that's really useful. Self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure that a lot of you have already come across this, and if you haven't, brace yourself. It is one of the most poorly used and most consistently used psychological pieces of a psychological theory concept kind of explanation. It's stuffed into absolutely everything. You look at it in media, you look at it in business studies, the lot. So it's good in some ways because it raises our awareness of psychology, but it does need to be, even Maslow said, regularly changed and altered and improved his model. He never suggested a physical triangle. People have since put that in place to elaborate the concept. However, the basic concept is that we have 5 levels of needs, and each one of those needs needs to be met so that finally we can self-actualize. Okay, and the needs are basic physiological needs, as you can see there: air, being able to breathe, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, sexual desires, all the basic physical needs that all animals have. Next, it's safety, so personal security. Do you feel safe in a room? Employment safety, are you worried that you might get fired soon? Resources, are you worried you're going to run out of money? Health, are you worried that you're unwell? And property, are you worried someone's going to steal something from you? Love and belonging, so do you have friendship, intimacy, families, a sense of connection? Do you feel like people love you, respect you? Do you belong somewhere? And finally, esteem, and we're going to break that down a little bit further in a moment, but do you have self-esteem? Do you view yourself in a positive way? And finally, self-actualization, to become the full person that you can be. A little bit more information about the hierarchy of needs. Revolutionary because it focused on health. So I've put psychopathology and put a cross through it because Freud always focused on where human development went wrong, where it wasn't appropriate. And here Maslow focuses on positive psychology, and that's actually an area in psychology. The focus on health and how a healthy human development, because he felt that if people were given the structure for healthy human development, it supports people to become more healthy human beings. Where if you like Freud and just focus on psychopathology, it tells you when things go wrong, but it doesn't tell you how to improve and how to get better. The first 4 stages are described as deficiency needs, and they are needs that come through deprivation. So if you have a look back on here, if you're deprived of physiological safety, love or belonging, or self-esteem or esteem needs, then if you're deprived of those, that's where the need comes from. And as time passes, they intensify. So the longer you're hungry, the more intense that physiological need is. The longer that you're alone and not accepted, the more intense that need is. So those stages are resolved by getting something, so that you're no longer deprived of it. The final stage is a being need, and is the desire to grow. So it's different. It's not a deficiency, but it's a desire to improve and move forward, and that's self-actualization. You can move through backwards and forwards through the stages. So Maslow uses the example of divorce. Somebody might have many of the needs, so physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, and esteem. However, when they go through a divorce, they might drop all the way down to safety needs because they haven't got personal security, because they don't know what's going to happen to the house. They certainly haven't got love and belonging because they're no longer accepted or don't feel like they're accepted by someone, and possibly their esteem has been impacted as well because no one loves them. The divorce has knocked their confidence. The same with absolutely anything. So you move backwards and forwards throughout your life. It's not that you go through the stages, you self-actualize, and then boom, you self-actualize forever. Esteem needs can be broken down into esteem for oneself, so self-esteem essentially, and the desire for esteem from others, so reputation and respect from others. So esteem for yourself, how good do you think you are, and then how much do you think other people respect you. And then self-actualization, direct quote from Maslow, is to become everything one is capable of becoming. So self-actualization is to be the best that you can possibly be. You don't need to know about this, but I just thought you might be interested to give you an idea. People have developed Maslow's extended, and other people have extended Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So they all accept that these deficiency needs are really key still, physiological safety, etc., etc. But then they identified more growth needs, so cognitive needs, aesthetic needs, self-actualization, and then transcendence. Don't worry too much, but just to make you aware that his hierarchy has been extended and developed throughout time. And I'll give you an example of the moving through the hierarchy. So being able to access education, the way you sit in the class, the physiological needs. If you're hungry, thirsty, or tired, you're not going to be able to concentrate on the lesson. You're not going to be able to take the information in. If you're starving, hungry, and I regularly hear people talk about how hungry they are in lesson. So I do know that is something that affects your ability to concentrate. Safety needs, if you're worried about money, worried about getting kicked out, you have an illness that you're very worried might impact you and won't be able to allow you to complete your exams, you're not going to be able to concentrate on the lesson because you're worrying about how you're going to get, if you're going to run out of money, not be able to afford food. Are you worried that when you go home you're going to have a massive argument with your parents and get kicked out? All of those things. Love and belonging. So love and belonging, if you don't have that, maybe it's thinking someone in the class hates you, so then you can't concentrate on the lesson either, so you're not being able to self-actualize and develop and improve because all you can think about is that group of people over there whispering about you, that group of people that don't like you, that don't accept you. And then esteem. So esteem needs self-esteem. I'm not clever enough to understand this. I don't think I'm clever enough. And then esteem, respect, reputation from others. The teacher and the student. I don't think the teacher and the other students don't think I can understand this. If you meet all of these at any point, so if you weren't hungry, then the next stage to be considered would be safety needs. So you might not be hungry, but you might be worried about getting kicked out. So it's all, you can't move forward to self-actualize. And then finally, self-actualization. So you would be able to, if all of those needs were met, you weren't hungry, thirsty, tired, you weren't worried about any safety needs, you felt physically safe, so there wasn't a big fire in the corner of the room that you were worried was going to explode and kill you all. Love and belonging, you felt like there was no one in the class who hated you, that mostly you were all accepted. Esteem, you felt confident that if you tried hard enough you would be able to understand this. It's not that you're not clever enough, it's just tricky at the moment and you will be able to understand it. And if you felt like the teacher believed you'd be able to understand it and the other students didn't think you couldn't, then you would be able to self-actualize and access the lesson, access learning and education. Focus on the self and congruence. So a couple of definitions, key terms that aren't on the spec, but you need to know them to be able to explain the concept of the self and congruence. You have self-image, and this is the view you have of yourself. It doesn't necessarily reflect reality, rather what you think of yourself. So if I said to you, describe yourself, what do you think of yourself? That's your self-image. Who do you think you are? Your self-worth or your self-esteem, it's another term for self-esteem, is how much value you place on yourself, how worthful do you think you are? Do you think you're a worthwhile person? And then the ideal self is what you wish you really were. So this is what you would like to be, the dream you. And we can draw parallels with psychodynamic approach, even though there's no links between the two, in that obviously that the superego has a view of the ideal self. The word congruent means in agreement or harmony, and incongruent means in disagreement. And if we combine all of those terms together, and we'll come back to the idea of high and low self-esteem. So imagine the self-image and ideal self like two circles, and then the self-worth in the middle is the overlap. If your self-image, your view of yourself, and what you would like to be are very, very different, you'll have very little overlap and therefore very low self-worth, and you cannot self-actualize. You have low self-esteem, so you're not meeting that deficiency. You've got a deficiency, you're not meeting that need, so you won't be able to self-actualize. So, and then therefore you'd be described as incongruent. You'd have an incongruent self. So if your self-image was that you weren't very clever, and your ideal self is that you'd like to be very clever, then you won't have much self-worth. Whereas if you are more congruent, then your self-image and your ideal self are very similar. There's a lot of overlap. So you think your ideal self would be somebody who works hard and does lots of revision, and your self-image is that you do work hard, you do a lot of revision, you get all the work that you need done, and therefore there's more overlap, higher levels of self-worth, and therefore more likely that you will be able to self-actualize. You've met that final deficiency need. So here where it talks about congruence equals high self-esteem, incongruence equals low self-esteem, and you cannot self-actualize without congruence. So self-image is exactly how you view self, and the ideal self is what you wish you were like, and how congruent you are or how incongruent guides your self-worth, your self-respect, your self-esteem. So people, for example, a strong example would be people with experiencing eating disorders, so somebody with anorexia nervosa, it's not based on reality, so their self-image might be that they were very, very fat, and greedy, and their ideal self is somebody who doesn't need to eat at all. They exist on air, or maybe a single, 100 calories a day, and they feel there is very little overlap because they feel like they're very fat and they're very greedy because they eat, even in reality, if it's a very, very small amount, they feel like they eat too much. Maybe they have to have 3 apples a day. Their ideal self is that they only need to eat a slice of apple a day, and they should be really thin. So there's very, very little overlap. So they have very little self-worth, very low self-esteem, and therefore really, really struggle to self-actualize. And then roles of condition of worth. So unconditional positive regard is a concept that is in that comes in with counselling, which we'll look at in a moment as well. So the idea that's an unconditional positive regard. So unconditional means without judgment, without conditions in place, and we'll look at some conditions in a moment. Positive regard, acceptance and love. So unconditional positive regard is that somebody will accept you and love you without judgment, without question, and the place we should get unconditional positive regard from the most is our parents, or people caring for us, people raising us. No matter what we do, then they will still love us. They'll put in place boundaries, they will challenge us, but they will, no matter what we do, they will never stop loving us. And then conditional positive regard is when people only accept you, only love you with certain requirements, when you meet certain requirements or conditions. For example, parents only loving a child if they get a good grade, someone only being friends with someone if they're straight, so if if they're homophobic, a partner who only loves someone if they buy them gifts. So the conditions would be good grades, being straight, or getting gifts. A really strong example of unconditional positive regard, and from a humanistic point of view, would be when you watch some documentaries and you see people's families who still stand by people in prison who've committed awful crimes such as murder, and they say, well, we can't stop loving that person, they're still our son, they're still our daughter, we don't agree with what we've did, but we accept and love them without judgment. There are no conditions on their love. We can never stop loving them. Conditional positive regard is viewed as a bad thing by humanists. We should offer unconditional positive regard. And I think it was Rogers who worked with sex offenders and murderers, and even a war criminal who committed these atrocities, and they said it was incredibly difficult, but I had to offer unconditional positive regard, so acceptance without judgment. Conditional positive regard leads to conditions of worth. Conditions of worth are what we develop when we take on board other people's values and ideas of how we should be. So we go, okay, these are the conditions that are put in place to receive love. These are the conditions of worth. To be worth something, these are the conditions that I must meet. And we take them stereotypically from parents, from peers around us, from people who care for us, people who raise us, people who have a significant effect on our childhood lives. So we go, right, okay, so the condition of me being a good person is that I do these things. And obviously if they're in healthy conditions, I'm only a worthwhile person if I've got good grades, I'm only a worthwhile person if I'm straight, I'm only a worthwhile person if I'm giving people things. If there is conflict between your conditions of worth, the values that people tell you should meet, and your authentic self, who you are as a person, and kind of what you believe, if there's a conflict between those two, it leads to tension and incongruence. So therefore you have a lack of self-esteem, and you can't self-actualize. So being gay is wrong would be a condition of worth. Being an artist is not a proper job, is a condition of worth. Nice people do not dislike other people. So if there's conflict between your understanding, your conditions of worth, your beliefs, and who you are, so if you're being told that being gay is wrong but you are also gay, that's going to cause a huge amount of incongruence. If you're being told being an artist is not a proper job but your authentic self is to be a creative person, then that is going to cause conflict. If you're told that nice people do not dislike other people but you have a horrible person in your life who's being really awful to you, that you shouldn't be spending time with, then that's going to cause problems with incongruence, lack of self-esteem, and therefore an inability to self-actualize. Boys don't cry is another example of condition worth. Okay. And then finally, the humanist approach had a massive influence on counselling psychology. So, and this is where we link in with the unconditional positive regard. So they moved forward, they changed it. You can see a comparison between psychodynamic and humanist counselling. So Rogers, coming from an ideographic point of view, thought that individuals were experts in themselves, so should be the people involved in finding the solution. So the psychologist should be there to support and to guide the individual, who is an expert in themselves, to develop a solution that best suits them, rather than maybe psychodynamic, where they say, right, this is the thing, this is what's wrong with you, this is how you fix it. In humanist counselling, and now widely accepted in a lot of psychological counselling, the individual is guided to think about what solutions is best for them as an individual. The person is encouraged to talk openly, and the counsellor reflects back what the client is saying. So there'll be a lot of times where counsellors are trained to listen to what the person is saying, say, right, okay, so I think what you're saying is. They're supposed to act as a mirror. They're supposed to make sense of what the person is talking about, summarise it, conclude it, and then without making any judgment or changing it in any way, reflect it back to the client, who's then, because it's reflected back to them, is allowed to reflect on it. The aim is to enter the client's world, so to come to the client and understand things from their perspective. So remember what I said right at the beginning, it's not about what's actually reality, it is about what the client's perspective is, and all the time offering unconditional positive regard. So at no point going, what you've said is wrong, that's a bad thing to think, you're a bad person for thinking those things. Accepting them, sort of listening to, and always accepting that person, respecting that person, showing positive regard for that person, regardless of what they have said, because they're encouraged to talk openly. And then you can see the comparison. Psychodynamic is authoritative. Authoritative is belief that the person, this counsellor, determines what is spoken about and how the problem is resolved. Whereas in the humanist, the person is to listen, to be non-directive, and allow the client to guide the session and come to their own conclusions and come to their own solutions as well. In psychodynamic, the therapist knows best. They're the expert. They guide the solutions. They interpret the unconscious for them. The person, it removes all control and all free will and all choice from the person taking the counselling. You can't access your unconscious. You can't understand it. You can't think about it. I'm an expert. I know about it. You tell me what you're thinking. I will work out what your unconscious is telling you, and therefore what is the best thing to do. Whereas the humanist approach, that the client is the expert. The client knows best as the individual, and supports the individual, but it's the patient, the individual themselves, that finds a solution. Psychodynamic, the focus is all unconscious desires which control their actions. So we don't know about them. All we know is that our actions happen, and they control, and it's driven by that unconscious, unknowing thing that's happening, repression, whatever, the conflict of the Oedipus complex, whatever it might be. Whereas humanists reject all of that together. They're not interested in the slightest in unconscious influences. They're interested in the conscious mind, believing we're responsible for our own actions, which links back to free will, the fact that we have control over our own actions. So you do need to be aware of how we moved. Psychodynamic kind of triggered the talking therapies, was really, really significant, but then humanists took it from psychodynamic and moved it further, refined it and improved it, and moved it further even forward even more. Although both forms of counselling do exist, you can go to a psychodynamic counsellor and you can go to a humanist counsellor as well. Okay, so that's everything for AO1. So there's quite a bit of AO1, but finally evaluation, supporting evidence, practical applications, evaluation of methodology, and contrast to alternatives, which is where we contrast with alternatives, or we look at the issues and debates and link it in that way, so you can embed those kind of views and that understanding. There is supporting evidence from Harter, who found that children who felt they had to meet certain criteria to achieve parents' approval did not like themselves, and they found they experienced depression. And I'd like you to have a think for this one, how that link, which part of AO1 that links to. For really strong A2 evaluation points, you need to be able to tell me how that link, what AO1, what terminology, what part of the theory that links to. What what the idea of meeting certain criteria, and if you don't, disliking yourselves links to, so you can explain that and link it back, and that would be incredibly impressive. That's what you could make notes on. And then Haggerty, which is another one, you don't have to know both, but it's a useful one to be aware of, and it is mentioned in the CAT book as well, is the idea that economic development follows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So countries that are just starting in their economic development process very much focused on those 4 lower deficiency needs, so physiological, safety, etc., etc. Then when they meet all of those and as they develop further, the focus becomes on self-esteem and self-actualization, which is why a lot more potential, well, there's lots of arguments why this happens, but you could argue potentially that is why things like education is more sought after in economically developed countries, and is more available, and also counselling as well, to develop self-esteem, to build people up. When you're focused on where your next meal's coming from, those things don't matter as much, but when you've mastered those, when you've moved up the needs, you don't need to focus on those deficiency needs, they've been met, then you can focus on the being needs. Practical applications, of course, is the counselling we've just talked about. It's called person-centred therapy, because as you were hopefully aware by the way we've talked about it, the person is at the centre, and you could talk a little bit about that person-centred therapy, the compact unconditional positive regard, the individual is the expert, all of those things. If you wanted to, you could also remember this, that Gibbard and Hanley, and this is something I did some research in 2008, found that a pre-post therapy effect size, so comparing pre and post therapy, the improvement in pre and post therapy over a huge sample over 5 years was an effect size of 1.2. So that is statistically very significant. The effect size are quite complex. If you're familiar with them in maths, that's great. I'm not hugely familiar with them, if I'm honest, but it's an indication that the therapy was very, very effective in a large sample over a long period of time, so you could evaluate that as well. It's reliable because it's consistently found over a long period of time, test, retest, and also obviously think about the sample, how big that is, population validity representative. Evaluations of methodology, one of the biggest problems is they reject scientific evidence, therefore we can't collect empirical data, and so we can't necessarily falsify claims, we can't conduct falsifiability, so apply all of that features of science to it as a problem. And then contrast to alternatives. So a strength is, or a weakness is, you could approach it either way. You know about nomothetic and idiographic. A strength or a weakness of the research of the theory is that it's idiographic, which is very different from nomothetic. We could talk about that. It focuses on the individual, it allows us to gather lots of detail. So it can be very effective in one individual place. However, it doesn't allow us, and you could have balance within one evaluation point. You've got the however sentences. However, again, much like rejecting scientific methods, it doesn't allow us to develop general laws, so we can't develop theories which then could support a huge number of people. It's only individual to the person. So very effective for the individual, but doesn't allow us to develop general laws. Also, there is cultural bias, so there's big problems with Maslow's hierarchy of need, the difference between individualistic and collectivist cultures, which I think we talked about as well. So Maslow's hierarchy of need is very much based on self-improvement, within which individualistic cultures such as Britain and America would work really, really well. In collectivist cultures, generally more Eastern cultures, it's not about how much you can achieve as an individual, it's how much you achieve as a group. So the comparison would be self-actualization in an individualistic society would be becoming employee of the month, whereas in a collectivist society you want everybody, so you want your whole department, your whole group, your whole organisation to improve and move forward together. So that self-actualization doesn't really work. And there is another again, you don't need to know it, but I'll include it on the next slide. There's another kind of hierarchy that was developed that supported collectivist cultures, suggesting that it lacks that it's culturally biased. There you go. So that's the collectivist hierarchy of need. As you can see, the order has been shuffled around a little bit, and of course it doesn't necessarily apply to individuals either, but we can talk about cultural bias because it's something from the issues and debates. So belonging and social is the most important thing, and then after that it becomes about physiological needs, safety needs, and finally self-actualization, which in this case is defined as the service of in the service of society, so not what you can do best as an individual. You don't have to know about that, but obviously it's a useful thing to be aware of. That is everything to do with the humanist approach, and therefore we have finished the approaches altogether. Well done for making it through, and I hope that you're able to psychodynamic and humanist, whilst have some quite challenging views, are really interesting approaches and still influence the way we work in psychology today, so are you really useful to be aware of.